The Galactic Council chamber of the Vrexon Empire was a sprawling expanse of marble-like stone suspended within a glimmering energy dome, its arches and geometric patterns symbolizing the unity and technological might of the Empire. Holographic projections flickered around the perimeter, each displaying intelligence feeds of the latest planetary incursions and victories. Senior Commander Zavik, a towering, blue-skinned Galari with a high-crested head and 4 bristling chin tendrils, leaned back in his ornately engraved chair, exuding an aura of practiced disdain. He raised one clawed hand and pointed at a holographic projection of a small blue-green world Earth. Primitive species, he sneered, tapping the display. Wooden dwellings. Metallic combustion tubes they call guns, hardly worth the effort. The assembled council of military leaders erupted into ripples of laughter and murmured agreement. Clawed Tazanics clicked their mandibles in amusement. Feathery murr that preened their plumage, and even the insectoid Krathari emitted high-pitched vibrations of mirth. To Zavik, it was a satisfying display of how easily the council could be swayed against such a primitive nuisance. It was a show of their collective superiority. Zavik turned his gaze to General Zathar, a writhing mass of tentacles with a single unblinking eye that gleamed with cold intelligence. "Tell me, General, why have you called this meeting?" Zavik gestured lazily, as if the matter were of little consequence. Zathar's tentacles trembled, betraying tension beneath his composed exterior. His eyes swiveled and locked onto Zavik. "Because humans resist, Commander." Zavik leaned forward, his amusement slipping. "Resist," he scoffed, barely containing a derisive laugh. "With what? The sticks they hurl down the metal tubes? Spears, but noisier." "They have creativity," Zathar said, his voice dripping with disdain for even having to admit it. "We underestimated them. Our soldiers at Fort Parthas didn't return. Their transmission before being cut off showed their guns." At this, the council members shifted uncomfortably. The laughter died down, replaced by murmurs of confusion and incredulity. Zavik's face darkened. He waved a hand dismissively, refusing to show any sign of doubt. "Then I will lead the assault myself," he declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "This is a matter of pride. I refuse to let an inferior species, humans, stand in the way of our great empire." Silence gripped the chamber. Zathar's eye flickered, but he said nothing, sinking back into his containment sphere. He knew better than to argue further. The rest of the council watched intently, curious to see how the great Zavik would handle the challenge of a species everyone had dismissed as weak and insignificant. Days later, Senior Commander Zavik's flagship, the Vara's Wrath, arrived in Earth's orbit. The ship was a colossal construct, bristling with weaponry and surrounded by smaller escort ships. Below them, Earth's surface stretched out in blues, greens, and browns, oblivious to the impending onslaught. In a matter of hours, Vrexon troop transports rumbled through the atmosphere, carrying legions of heavily armed warriors. The first landing site was a muddy clearing surrounded by rolling hills, a strategically unimportant location that the humans had chosen to make their stand. Zavik scoffed at the sight. A cluster of human soldiers, clad in mismatched combat gear and wielding guns that appeared outdated even by their primitive standards, stood ready. Zavik descended with great pomp, surrounded by elite guards clad in shimmering battle armor. He stepped forward, his ornate armor gleaming beneath the gray clouds, projecting an air of unbreakable dominance. The lead human stepped out from the line to meet him, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sun-darkened skin, piercing blue eyes, and a calm demeanor that betrayed no fear. "I am Zavik, High Commander of the Vrexon Empire," Zavik announced, his translator module magnifying his voice with thunderous authority. "Surrender your world, and I will grant mercy." The human, who had introduced himself as Sergeant Mark Phelan during brief pre-landing communications, considered the offer for exactly 2 seconds. Then he shook his head. "Nope." Zavik's brow furrowed, taken aback by the bluntness. "You refuse." Mark nodded, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Yeah, gonna have to decline with a casual motion." He unslung his rifle, a rugged-looking weapon that seemed like an antique in comparison to Vrexon technology. He glanced over his shoulder and made a simple gesture. "Boys!" The line of human soldiers nodded. Weapons were raised. Eyes hardened, The humans braced themselves for what was to come. Zavik sneered, turning back to his communicator. All units advance. The Vrexon warriors surged forward. Their plasma rifles discharged brilliant bolts of green energy, scorching the ground and leaving trails of vapor. Protective barriers crackled to life, projecting shimmering domes of defense around their armored bodies. The Galeri marched confidently, certain that their technological superiority rendered them untouchable. Then the humans opened fire. The air erupted with the deafening roar of their weapons. One Vrexon soldier staggered as a bullet struck his shield, the kinetic impact more forceful than anticipated. Another fell, his armor failing against the relentless barrage. The humans fired with precision, unleashing a storm of bullets that shattered shields and pierced armor. Smoke curled from their barrels, brass casings ejected in a rhythmic symphony. Shouts rang out, punctuating the relentless rhythm of gunfire. Commander shouted a Galeri lieutenant as he ducked behind cover, his shield flickering. Their weapons they're breaking through. Zavik stared, disbelief etched across his features. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had calculated plasma resistance and accounted for physical munitions. But the humans' guns, rifles, machine guns, sniper rifles all relied on a single, devastating principle concentrated kinetic force. They weren't elegant, but they were brutally effective. The Galeri formation began to falter. Plasma shields strained under continuous fire, buckling and collapsing. The humans moved with ruthless efficiency. When one line of fire slowed, another picked up. Mark and his team adapted constantly, using suppressive fire to pin the enemy, scavenging ammunition from fallen comrades, and switching weapons to counter armor weaknesses. Fall back, Zavik roared, the words bitter in his throat. He watched in stunned horror as human soldiers surged forward, pushing his elite warriors into disarray. One of his personal guards had his helmet shattered by a close-quarters shotgun blast, the concussive force ripping him apart. The same primitive weapon shattered energy fields like they were made of glass. Fall back. The Vrexon troops retreated, scattering toward the edges of the clearing. Amidst the chaos, Sergeant Mark Phelan grinned and gave chase. His comrades followed, their laughter echoing a wild, adrenaline-fueled cacophony that mingled with the sound of gunfire. Every shot, every explosion was a reminder that the Vrexon Empire had underestimated Earth's defenders. Back aboard the Vera's Wrath, Zavik stormed into the command center, his once pristine armor scorched and dented. Smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal clung to him. His eyes blazed as he activated a holographic link to Zathar. The general's holographic form flickered to life, his single eye narrowing. "Explain yourself," Zavik spat, his voice raw with fury. "These humans." "I warned you," Commander Zathar said, his tone almost mocking. "They are adaptive, far more than we anticipated." Zavik slammed a fist into the console, denting it. "They are brutes. Savage, undisciplined brutes." He recalled one moment in particular. A human woman had charged directly at a fortified position, using nothing but a crude grenade. She had lobbed it with deadly precision, shattering barriers and annihilating their defensive line. No species uses such savage implements so effectively. Zathar's tentacles weaved lazily. They may be primitive, but they are relentless. They innovate. When one weapon fails, they create another. When armor resists, they aim for its weak points. Zavik snarled, his fury mounting. "We will adapt as well. We are superior." He turned to his tactical advisors, issuing rapid-fire commands. "Deploy the Vorach cannons. We will burn their strongholds from orbit." Even as he spoke, the humans were regrouping. Down below, Mark Phelan sat on the edge of a ruined transport, drinking water and grinning with his fellow soldiers as they reviewed the carnage they had inflicted. A small drone zipped by, scouting enemy positions and feeding data back to their makeshift headquarters. "They really don't get it, do they?" Mark said, shaking his head. His face was tired, but his eyes were alight with the thrill of battle. Duncan, a wiry man with a knack for building improvised explosives, laughed. "Nope, they think we're just throwing sticks." Mark stood, stretching his sore muscles. "Well, we've got more sticks," he said, his voice carrying a note of grim resolve. and I think it's time we got creative. The next day dawned with an eerie stillness, broken only by the distant rumble of Vrexon transports descending once more. This time they moved with a calculated precision. The Vrexon Empire had not survived centuries of interstellar conquest without learning from its mistakes, and Zavik had taken no chances. The soldiers that emerged from the dropships wore thicker, multi-layered shields, and their armor had been reconfigured to better resist high-velocity projectiles. Plasma rifles were modified to discharge concentrated bursts at a faster rate, and squads moved with overlapping formations that seemed impervious to frontal assault. Zavik stood atop a rise, his gaze fixed on the human positions below. This time, there will be no resistance, he murmured to himself. He activated a communicator. General Zathar, are you monitoring? The holographic form of Zathar appeared beside him, translucent but unmistakably smug. I am here, Commander. Watch closely, Zavik said. Their ingenuity ends today. On the ground, Sergeant Mark Phelan observed the Vrexon formation from a makeshift command post nestled among shattered buildings. His face was set in a grim line as he took in the enemy's new tactics. He recognized the overlapping shields and the disciplined, almost mechanical movement of their units. They've learned, Mark said quietly, but there was no panic in his voice. He glanced at Duncan, who was tinkering with a modified rocket launcher. They've upped their game. How's our big surprise coming? Duncan grinned, wiping sweat from his forehead. All ready to go, Sarge. Just say the word. Mark nodded. Good. He looked around at his soldiers, some crouched behind rubble, others inspecting their weapons. They're going to come at us harder this time. We hold the line. Remember, hit him fast, hit him hard, and keep moving. The humans prepared themselves. They scavenged ammunition, repurposed debris into barriers, and set traps in every conceivable location. Children of Earth's long history of conflict, they understood that victory came not from overwhelming firepower alone, but from adaptation, resourcefulness, and sheer tenacity. The Vrexon advance began with a wall of green plasma fire that seared through the air. Humans ducked behind cover as the ground erupted around them. The Vrexon marched steadily, shields forming a near impenetrable wall. Behind them, heavy artillery drones deployed, their energy cannons swiveling to rain destruction. Duncan, now Mark yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. Duncan flipped a switch, activating a hidden array of electromagnetic pulse EMP devices. The air crackled, and a thunderous boom echoed across the battlefield. The pulse surged outward, its effect immediate and devastating. Vrexon shields flickered, shorted, and failed. Artillery drones powered down, their targeting systems freed. The humans didn't hesitate. They opened fire, bullets streaking toward the exposed enemy lines. Without their shields, Vrexon soldiers found themselves vulnerable once more. Plasma rifles discharged erratically, some failing to fire altogether. Human bullets ripped through armor, finding seams and weak spots with lethal precision. Advance, Mark shouted, leading his troops in a charge. The humans surged forward, their momentum fueled by adrenaline and a fierce determination to protect their home. Zavik watched the battlefield with a mix of rage and disbelief. How he demanded, his voice cracking. How do they keep doing this? Zathar's hologram flickered. This is what I warned you about. They adapt faster than any species we have encountered. Shut up, Zavik spat, but his anger was turning to desperation. He knew that if this attack failed, it would mean not only the loss of his reputation, but also a significant blow to the Vrexon Empire's prestige. He deployed the Onyx Battalion, he ordered. No more games. From the skies, the Onyx Battalion descended an elite force within the Vrexon military known for their ruthlessness and unmatched combat prowess. Clad in obsidian armor that absorbed and deflected kinetic energy, they hit the ground like meteorites, sending shockwaves through the earth. Each soldier carried a plasma sword alongside their rifles, a symbol of their status and their readiness for close-quarters combat. Mark saw the Onyx Battalion land and cursed under his breath. Duncan, we've got company. No kidding, Duncan muttered, loading a fresh rocket. Those guys look like they eat bullets for breakfast. Then let's give them a feast. Mark raised his rifle and took aim. The battle intensified. The Onyx Battalion moved with terrifying efficiency, cutting down human fighters with swift strikes of their plasma blades. They absorbed bullet impacts that would have dropped lesser soldiers, their obsidian armor diffusing kinetic force with eerie precision. For the first time, it seemed that the Vrexon had found an answer to humanity's raw firepower. Mark fought with everything he had, emptying his magazine and reloading in seconds. He saw a squad of his men overwhelmed, their positions torn apart by coordinated plasma fire. Gritting his teeth, he barked out orders to regroup and fall back to secondary lines. Pull back. Keep moving. The humans retreated in bursts, covering each other as they fell back to pre-prepared defensive positions. As they moved, Mark grabbed a handheld radio. Duncan, is the secondary surprise ready? Duncan's voice crackled back, strained but determined. Yeah, but it's a one-shot deal. Make it count. Roger that? Duncan activated a hidden array of improvised explosive devices buried beneath key terrain features. The ground erupted in a series of controlled detonations, sending Vrexon troops flying and carving a brutal gap in their lines. The humans pressed the advantage, firing from every angle, using guerrilla tactics to whittle down their enemies' numbers. Amidst the chaos, one of the Onyx Battalion leaders, a towering Vrexon wielding a plasma sword nearly as long as a man, charged directly at Mark. The two clashed in a brutal melee, the Vrexon's strength and armor giving him the upper hand. Mark barely dodged a sweeping strike, the heat from the blade searing his skin. He countered with a shotgun blast at close range, the impact denting the Vrexon's armor but failing to penetrate. The Vrexon warrior laughed, a deep, guttural sound. Your weapons are useless, human. Yeah, Mark panted, backing up. Let's test that theory. He yanked the pin from a fragmentation grenade and jammed it into the crack in the Vrexon's armor. The warrior's eyes widened as Mark dove for cover. The explosion ripped through the Vrexon's torso, leaving only a smoldering crater behind. Mark stood, battered but alive. Around him, the humans fought with everything they had: knives, fists, makeshift explosives, whatever it took to win. The battle raged on, brutal and unrelenting. In orbit, Zavik watched the carnage unfold on his displays. His elite battalion was faltering. The humans' relentless adaptability and refusal to give in had turned what should have been a swift victory into a nightmare. He slammed his fists into the console, cracking the surface. Enough. Prepare the orbital bombardment. One of his advisors, a jittery Murda named Talaris, hesitated. Commander, that will risk annihilating. I don't care, Zavik roared, his voice raw with desperation and fury. Do it now. The Vara's Wrath began charging its orbital cannons, preparing to unleash devastation on a scale that would wipe out everything below, friend and foe alike. Energy crackled along massive conduits as the weapon systems activated. On the ground, Mark and his team received word from their scouts. They're charging for an orbital strike, a young scout yelled, his face pale. They're going to flatten everything. Mark's mind raced. All right, he said, his voice steely. If they want to play that game, we'll make it cost them. The humans scrambled. Messages were relayed, resources gathered, and a desperate plan was formed. They couldn't match the Vrexon's firepower in a direct confrontation, but they could hit them where it hurt. The Vara's Wrath reached critical charge. Zavik's eyes gleamed with grim satisfaction. This ends now, he said. Hundreds of trails suddenly streaked skyward from Earth's surface. Zavik watched, incredulous. What is this, he demanded. Primitive missiles, Talaris replied, his voice trembling. They're trying to. One of the missiles detonated prematurely, unleashing a blinding electromagnetic pulse. Systems flickered and went dark. Consoles sparked. The energy buildup destabilized. Alarms blared as the ship's systems spiraled out of control. Shut it down, Zavik screamed, but it was too late. Feedback from the failed discharge raced through the ship's conduits, triggering explosions throughout multiple decks. The Vara's Wrath shuddered, sections of its hull tearing apart. Mark and his team watched from below as the sky lit up with fiery bursts. Duncan let out a low whistle. Didn't think that'd actually work. Mark nodded, his expression grim. EMP warheads. Old tech. Sometimes, old solutions work best. The humans had scavenged, modified, and repurposed outdated missiles, using them to cripple their technologically superior foe. It was a desperate move, but one that had paid off. But they weren't done yet. The Vrexon fleet hung in chaos above Earth, broken and flickering like dying embers against the vast expanse of space. The once mighty Vara's Wrath drifted in pieces, its power conduits sparking and hull shattered. Across its decks, fires raged unchecked and alarms wailed, a cacophony of failure that mirrored Zavik's own despair. He stumbled through the wreckage of the command center, his ornate armor blackened and cracked, smoke stinging his eyes. Status report, Zavik demanded, his voice raw. One of his surviving officers, a Krithari with fractured mandibles and one antenna missing, managed to crawl to a partially functioning console. Commander, the fleet is in disarray. The EMP attack disabled critical systems. Communications are unreliable. Shields offline. Zavik's taloned hand tightened around a broken railing. Patch me through to the ground forces. We are not beaten yet. He heard the distant echo of gunfire, through the hull a chilling reminder that humans had already boarded parts of the ship. Earth's defenders had no intention of stopping until their enemy was crushed. Down below, Sergeant Mark Phelan stood at the edge of a battered ridge, his face streaked with soot and his rifle low at his side. Around him, human fighters regrouped, taking precious moments to reload, patch each other up, and prepare for whatever came next. The exhaustion in their eyes spoke volumes. They'd fought hard, and it wasn't over yet. Scout reports, Mark asked, turning to Duncan, who was leaning against a half-ruined vehicle, still grinning despite everything. Duncan wiped blood from a gash on his forehead. Their fleet's a mess. Big explosion up there took out a chunk of their flagship. Bunch of them are still scrambling. Mark nodded. But there's still a threat. He looked up, squinting at the dark shape of the broken Vara's Wrath drifting in the atmosphere. And they're not going to go quietly. Neither are we, Duncan said, hefting a shotgun over one shoulder. Right, Mark drew in a deep breath. It's time to finish this. The humans launched an all-out assault on the scattered Vrexon forces. In the chaos of their orbital disaster, many of the invaders had been cut off from central command. Some turned to desperate, brutal tactics, using energy blades and plasma rifles to hold out in pockets of resistance. But the humans, who had spent centuries perfecting the art of unconventional warfare, moved with deadly precision. They deployed sniper teams to pick off Vrexon commanders, used drones to harass isolated squads, and rigged crude explosives to devastating effect. Civilians joined in, using their knowledge of the terrain to sabotage enemy equipment and disrupt supply lines. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was a war of attrition, and Earth's defenders refused to relent. As Mark led his team through the wreckage of a once grand plaza, they encountered fierce resistance. Plasma fire scorched the ground around them, forcing them to take cover behind crumbling pillars. A Vrexon soldier emerged, his obsidian armor gleaming as he raised a massive energy blade. The soldier charged, but Mark was faster. He stepped out, aimed, and fired 3 precise shots. The bullets found their mark in the seams of the armor, staggering the Vrexon. Duncan emerged from the side, launching a makeshift grenade that finished the job. The enemy fell, their armor cracked and leaking acrid smoke. We keep going, Mark said, motioning for his team to advance. We're close. They pressed forward, encountering more resistance as they made their way through the rubble-strewn streets. Human ingenuity was everywhere. They turned wrecked vehicles into barriers, fashioned spikes and traps from scrap metal, and used anything that could serve as a weapon. Each skirmish was brutal, but they adapted, learned, and pushed forward. Their ultimate target was the crashed wreck of the Vara's Wrath. Human scouts reported that Aksavik himself remained aboard, desperate to re-establish control. If they could take him out, it would break the Vrexon forces' morale and potentially force a full retreat. As they neared the shattered hull, Mark paused. This is it. We take him down and we end this. His team nodded grimly. Duncan patted the side of an old, heavily modified rocket launcher. Let's knock and say hello. Inside the Vara's Wrath, Aksavik rallied what was left of his command. The corridors were filled with wounded Vrexon soldiers and flickering lights. he snarled as his officers reported mounting losses and human incursions into the lower decks. "They're animals," one of his lieutenants said, fear evident in their eyes. "They fight like nothing we've seen." "They are vermin," Zavik spat. "Cornered, rabid vermin, we are superior." The sound of gunfire echoed through the hall. Human voices shouted commands, growing louder. Zavik felt a chill. He drew his energy blade, its bright blue light casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Prepare to repel boarders." Mark and his team breached the flagship's lower decks, using breaching charges to punch through fortified doors. Every step was a struggle. Vrexon ambushes, plasma grenades, and deadly traps littered their path. But they pressed on, determined to end it. They reached the command center, a large circular room filled with damaged consoles and sparking conduits. There stood Zavik, blade in hand, surrounded by the last of his elite guards. "Commander Zavik," Mark called, his voice carrying over the hum of energy. "It's over." Zavik sneered, his chin tendrils bristling. "You think a species as lowly as yours can defeat the Vrexon Empire?" Mark leveled his rifle. "Looks like we already did." The humans charged, gunfire roaring. The Vrexon guards fought with desperate fury, their plasma blades clashing with brutal efficiency. Mark's team moved as one, covering each other and exploiting every gap in the enemy's defenses. It was chaos, a whirlwind of fire, smoke, and screams. Zavik lunged at Mark, his energy blade carving through the air. Mark ducked, feeling the heat pass inches from his head. He countered with a shotgun blast, knocking Zavik back. The Vrexon commander roared and attacked again, each strike faster, more vicious. Sparks flew as metal met energy, and for a moment it seemed Zavik's strength would prevail. But Mark wasn't fighting alone. Duncan flanked the commander, firing off a series of rounds that dented Zavik's armor. Another human threw a grenade, forcing him back. Mark saw his opening. He surged forward, driving the butt of his rifle into Zavik's face. The commander staggered, his grip faltering. "This ends now," Mark said, his voice low and determined. Zavik sneered, even as defeat loomed. "You think your kind has won? The Empire will." Mark pulled the trigger. The Vrexon commander fell, his body crashing to the deck. Around them, the last of the Vrexon guards were cut down. Silence fell, broken only by the crackling of damaged systems. The surviving Vrexon forces, leaderless and demoralized, began to retreat. Human forces pushed them back, reclaiming ground and securing the remains of the enemy's technology. The message was clear: Earth would not be conquered. As the dust settled, Mark stepped outside the wreck of the Vara's Wrath, blinking in the sunlight. Duncan joined him, exhausted but alive. "Hell of a fight," Duncan said, managing a weak grin. Mark nodded, wiping sweat and grime from his brow. Yeah, he looked at the battered landscape around them: scorched earth, fallen comrades, and the remains of Vrexon war machines, and were still standing. The two shared a moment of quiet, then laughter, grim, weary, but full of relief. Others joined in. They had faced the impossible and survived. Earth had repelled an empire. "Come on," Mark said, shouldering his rifle. "There's work to do. They'll be back." "And we'll be ready," Duncan replied, his eyes hard with resolve. As they walked away, survivors rallied and began the arduous task of rebuilding. Humanity had proven once again that their strength lay not in their weapons, but in their determination, creativity, and refusal to give in. The Vrexon Empire had learned a harsh lesson: never underestimate Earth, for they were not just survivors, they were adapters, and they fought like no one else in the galaxy.